On a night when the Berlin Wall seemed quieter than usual, a single man walked through a dark street carrying something far more dangerous than a weapon. He carried information. Information capable of shifting the balance of the Cold War. While searchlights swept across the gray concrete and East German soldiers watched every shadow with fingers on their triggers, that man breathed slowly and repeated an identity that was not his own. To the world, he was just another worker of the socialist bloc. In reality, he was an American spy embedded deep inside enemy territory, living every day under the constant threat of being exposed, interrogated, or erased from existence. This is not just a spy story. It is the story of how one mistake could cost everything. At the height of the Cold War, East Germany was one of the most heavily surveilled places on Earth. The Stasi, the regime's secret police, trusted no one. Neighbors informed on neighbors, friends betrayed friends. Even families were torn apart by the paranoia of the state. Every phone call could be monitored. Every quiet conversation could be a test. It was inside this suffocating environment that American intelligence made a decision bordering on suicidal: to place human assets deep within East German society, not for quick missions, but for long-term infiltration. These agents did not come and go. They built false lives, accepted cover marriages, worked ordinary jobs, and followed rigid routines, all while secretly collecting military, political, and strategic secrets. Among these agents was a man whose real name remained classified for decades, a soldier trained not only to fight, but to vanish. Recruited at a young age, he endured a brutal preparation process. He learned German until he could think in the language. He studied regional accents, cultural habits, social behaviors, and even small superstitions. Nothing could give him away. A single misplaced word, an overly Western gesture, or an emotional reaction at the wrong moment could trigger fatal suspicion. Before crossing the Iron Curtain, he received one final instruction. If captured, the United States would deny his existence. Officially, he did not exist. The infiltration began slowly, almost painfully ordinary, exactly as it needed to be. He entered East Germany using forged documents crafted with obsessive precision. He assumed the identity of a displaced citizen shaped by war, someone with a blurred past that could not be easily verified, yet believable enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. He found work in a strategically sensitive area, close to logistical hubs and military transport routes. That was when the real game began. Every day became a psychological test. He had to appear frustrated with the regime, but never too critical, loyal but never enthusiastic, invisible yet convincingly human. One wrong move could end everything. The true danger, however, did not come only from armed guards or interrogation rooms. It came from small details: a coworker who asked too many questions, a neighbor who paid attention at the wrong times, a woman who became interested too quickly. The Stasi frequently used relationships as traps, knowing that emotion was the weakest link in any covert operation. Many agents were exposed not through technology, but through human connection. Still, this American pressed forward. He used ingenious methods to transmit intelligence: microfilm hidden inside everyday objects, coded phrases embedded in ordinary letters, and brief public encounters where a simple brush of shoulders meant the exchange of state secrets. Over time, the intelligence he gathered began to raise alarms in Washington. Troop movements that didn't match official statements, unusual military drills, silent changes in East Germany's command structure, signs of deeper coordination with the Soviet Union. Each detail became a vital piece of a massive geopolitical puzzle. And the more valuable his information became, the greater the danger. The Stasi was not blind. As strategic leaks became apparent, a silent hunt began. Someone was talking. Someone was betraying the state, and the question haunting the intelligence apparatus was simple and deadly: who? Meanwhile, the American agent started to notice subtle changes around him. Conversations felt staged, coworkers were summoned for routine interviews, surveillance lingered just a little too long. Casual chats turned into psychological probes. He knew that in this world, the end never arrived with warning. When the Stasi moved, it was usually already too late. Yet stopping was not an option. To suddenly withdraw or change behavior itself would raise suspicion, and in East Germany, suspicion alone could be a death sentence. But an even greater threat was approaching. A mistake made by another agent somewhere else in the network threatened to expose the entire operation. Documents were on the verge of falling into the wrong hands. If that happened, not only would the mission collapse, but the lives of every infiltrated spy would be at risk, including his. In the next part of this story, we will uncover how a single slip nearly destroyed one of the most daring espionage operations of the Cold War, forcing this American spy to face the ultimate nightmare: exposure with no escape. The mistake that threatened everything did not happen in East Germany. It happened far away, in an office where someone believed a file was more secure than it truly was. A name was written down when it should never have existed on paper. A connection was documented when it should have remained only in memory. Intelligence work depends on silence, and once silence breaks, it spreads like a crack through ice. Within weeks, fragments of classified material began circulating through channels that should have been sealed. No one knew exactly what the enemy had obtained, only that the pattern of exposure was changing. And for the American spy living inside East Germany, that uncertainty was far more terrifying than certainty itself. Back in his small apartment, the agent noticed the first undeniable sign that something was wrong. His radio, an old device he used only for state-approved broadcasts, was slightly out of place. Not broken, not damaged, just moved. The kind of detail no ordinary citizen would notice, but one that screamed intrusion to a trained operative. The Stasi was known for entering homes without leaving obvious evidence, rearranging objects just enough to test reactions. If he reacted, they would know. If he didn't, they would return. So he did what he was trained to do. He ignored it completely, sat down and lived his life as if nothing had happened, even though every instinct in his body told him the countdown had begun. At work, the atmosphere shifted. Jokes disappeared, conversations shortened. People watched each other more carefully. One of his colleagues, a man who used to complain endlessly about food shortages and long hours, suddenly became quiet and obedient. Another stopped coming to work altogether. No explanation, no farewell, just absence. In East Germany, absence was never a coincidence. The agent understood the message clearly. Someone was being questioned, someone was being broken, and every interrogation brought the Stasi one step closer to him. The Americans' handlers, communicating through heavily encrypted channels, sent a chilling update. The network was compromised, but the extent was unknown. Extraction was discussed, then dismissed. Pulling him out now would confirm suspicions. The safest place for him was exactly where he was, pretending to be exactly who he wasn't. He was instructed to reduce activity, slow information flow, and above all, avoid patterns. This was the most dangerous phase of any infiltration, the moment when survival depended not on action but on restraint. The Stasi, meanwhile, escalated quietly. They didn't arrest suspects immediately. They observed, they tested, they invited citizens for informal conversations. These meetings were psychological warfare. No accusations, no threats, just questions asked in the wrong order, details repeated with slight changes, stories compared against each other until contradictions appeared. One afternoon, the American received his invitation, a simple note, polite language, a request to discuss workplace efficiency. He knew exactly what it meant. Refusing was impossible. Accepting meant stepping directly into the lion's den. The interrogation room was intentionally unremarkable. No chains, no shouting, just two officers and a table. They asked about his background, his childhood, his opinions, questions he had rehearsed answers for hundreds of times. He responded calmly, even when they intentionally misquoted his previous statements, even when they suggested things that were untrue, waiting to see if he would correct them too quickly. Hours passed. Finally, they let him go. No warning, no conclusion. That was worse than an arrest, because it meant the investigation was still open. Days later, another development sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. A former American asset, captured years earlier, had begun cooperating with Eastern Bloc authorities. Under pressure, under torture, or simply to survive, he was talking. Names were still unclear, but locations were being discussed. Methods, patterns, the very techniques the agent in East Germany relied on to stay hidden. The walls were closing in, not with force, but with knowledge. Despite everything, the American continued his routine. He went to work, he stood in lines, he complained quietly like everyone else, but internally he began preparing for the worst. He memorized emergency protocols. He reviewed suicide contingencies that no one ever wanted to use, because in espionage, capture was not the end. It was the beginning of something far worse. The Stasi specialized in dismantling people slowly, extracting information piece by piece until nothing remained. One night, as he walked home under dim streetlights, he noticed a man behind him matching his pace, then another across the street, not hiding, not following closely, just present. This was not surveillance meant to gather information. It was surveillance meant to be seen. A message: we see you, we are watching. The American understood that the next move would decide everything. Stay and risk complete exposure. Run and confirm guilt. There was only one remaining option, one that required absolute precision and perfect timing. In the next part of this story, we will follow the most dangerous phase of his mission, the moment the American spy was forced to communicate under active surveillance, risking his life on a single exchange that could either save him or end his existence inside East Germany forever. By this point, the American spy understood a hard truth of intelligence work. When surveillance becomes visible, it is no longer about gathering information. It is about control. The Stasi wanted him to know he was being watched. They wanted fear to do the work for them. Every step he took, every pause, every glance could now be analyzed. Under such pressure, most people make mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what the Stasi was waiting for. The agent knew that if he tried to disappear, he would be arrested within hours. If he did nothing, the net would eventually close. That left only one option: communicate, under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The message he needed to send was simple in concept, but lethal in execution. He had to warn his handlers that surveillance was active, that compromise was likely, and that the window for extraction or damage control was closing fast. But in East Germany, communication itself was the crime. Every known method was compromised. Dead drops were monitored, mail was opened, radio signals were tracked. Even casual conversations could be recorded. The agent had to improvise, using a technique so subtle that it would appear meaningless to anyone except the person trained to recognize it. The opportunity came during what appeared to be a routine, almost boring moment: a public tram ride during rush hour. Hundreds of people, noise, movement, confusion. Surveillance agents hated crowds, but they also trusted them. In chaos, they believed individuals vanished. That was the weakness the American planned to exploit. Sitting near the back of the tram, he casually unfolded a newspaper, one he knew his handlers monitored indirectly through patterns. He circled nothing, highlighted nothing. He simply folded it in an unusual way, exposing a specific advertisement on the front page. A meaningless act to everyone else, a critical signal to those who knew how to read it. He exited the tram 3 stops earlier than usual, not to flee but to reinforce normalcy. Surveillance followed, predictably. He entered a small grocery store, picked up the same items he always bought, paid in cash, and left. The entire time his heart rate remained controlled. Panic would show, fear would show. Normalcy was his only armor. That night he slept without knowing whether his message had been understood, or whether it had sealed his fate. The response, when it came, was indirect. 2 days later, a routine broadcast aired on a Western radio frequency that most East Germans were forbidden to listen to, but many secretly did. Buried inside a cultural segment was a phrase that meant nothing to the general audience. To the agent, it meant everything. The message was clear. They had received his signal. He was not alone, but the help would not come easily. Extraction, if possible at all, would require conditions that might never exist. Until then, he was on his own. As days passed, the Stasi intensified pressure. A second interrogation followed, this time longer, more personal. Officers referenced small details from his life that they should not have known unless his apartment had been thoroughly searched. They mentioned neighbors by name, coworkers, a woman he had spoken to only once. This was not investigation anymore. It was intimidation. They were showing him how much they knew without revealing how much they didn't. The most dangerous space an agent can occupy is that uncertainty. Behind the scenes, the intelligence war expanded. Other American operatives across Eastern Europe began going silent. Safe houses were abandoned. Networks collapsed. It became clear that the compromise was larger than initially believed. The American inside East Germany was no longer just gathering intelligence. He had become a liability the agency might be forced to cut loose. This was the unspoken reality of espionage. Loyalty flowed in one direction, but survival demanded cold decisions. The agent began preparing for a possibility he had avoided thinking about for years, that no rescue would come. He reviewed what to say if arrested, what to deny, what to claim ignorance of. He rehearsed false confessions designed to waste time and protect others. He understood that if captured, his goal would not be escape, it would be containment, to ensure that what he knew died with him. One evening, as he returned home, he found his apartment door slightly open, not forced, just open. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing broken, but on the table sat an object that did not belong there, a file folder, empty, clean, placed deliberately in the center of the room. It was a message without words. We can take you whenever we want. The Stasi was done waiting. The American knew the next phase would be decisive. There would be no more warnings, no more tests. Either he would be arrested or he would vanish on his own terms. The choice was shrinking by the hour. In the next part, we will follow the most dangerous decision of his life, an attempted maneuver that had only been used successfully a few times, and that if it failed, would end not just his mission, but his life inside East Germany. The empty folder on the table was more terrifying than any interrogation room. It meant the Stasi no longer needed to hide. They had reached the final stage of their process, the moment when psychological pressure gave way to action. For the American spy, this was the point of no return. Staying meant inevitable arrest. Leaving meant confirming every suspicion they had. But there was a narrow space between those two outcomes, a space so risky that most agents never attempted it. To vanish without triggering immediate pursuit, he would have to move in a way that looked accidental, unplanned, almost tragic. The plan, if it could be called that, relied on chaos rather than stealth. East Germany was rigid, controlled, and predictable. That predictability was its weakness. The agent knew that when systems followed rules too strictly, unexpected disruptions created blind spots. His opportunity came in the form of a scheduled industrial inspection near a restricted transit corridor. Large movements of workers, temporary passes, and confused oversight created exactly the kind of noise he needed. But timing had to be perfect. Too early and surveillance would tighten. Too late and he would be arrested before moving at all. He prepared nothing visible, no bags, no documents, no obvious escape tools. Everything he needed was already in his head, routes memorized years earlier, behavioral patterns studied endlessly. Even then, success depended on one crucial factor: the Stasi believing he was still afraid. Fear made people predictable. Confidence made them suspicious, so he played his role carefully, allowing himself to appear tense, distracted, slightly unstable. enough to suggest pressure, but not enough to justify immediate detention. On the morning of the inspection, he joined the flow of workers like any other day. Surveillance was present, but looser than usual, spread thin by the scale of the operation. As planned, confusion followed. Credentials were checked hastily, names were waved through. In one brief moment, barely a minute long, the American stepped into a zone where his identity blurred into the crowd. He did not run, he did not hide, he simply failed to reappear where he was expected. For hours, nothing happened. That silence was dangerous. The Stasi did not react impulsively. They verified, they cross-checked, they waited. Only when his absence could no longer be explained did the alarms quietly activate. Checkpoints tightened, transport logs were reviewed, but by then the American was already executing the second phase of his disappearance, becoming someone else again. This phase was the most psychologically exhausting. He had to abandon not just his cover identity, but the habits that came with it. How he walked, how he spoke, even how he reacted to authority. Every reflex trained for survival in East Germany now had to be overwritten. The goal was not escape in the traditional sense, it was misdirection, to convince the Stasi he had fled in one direction while he moved in another. Evidence was planted carefully, small deliberate traces suggesting panic, a discarded item, a witness statement subtly encouraged. None of it confirmed anything, but together they told a story the Stasi would find believable, a compromised spy attempting a desperate escape. That story mattered, because while they chased it, they were not chasing him. But even the best deception has limits. Within days, the Stasi realized the escape narrative was incomplete, too clean, too controlled. The search expanded, becoming broader and more aggressive. Borders were scrutinized, records were pulled, and somewhere deep within the intelligence apparatus, a conclusion began to form. This was not a simple disappearance. This was a professional extraction attempt, even if no extraction had yet occurred. Meanwhile, the American existed in a state of constant motion, never staying long enough to be remembered, never speaking more than necessary. He relied on the most dangerous asset an agent can use: trust in strangers, people who did not know who he was and never could. Each interaction carried risk. Each night could be his last outside a cell. Then, without warning, a message reached him through a method so subtle it almost went unnoticed. Not an instruction, not a command, just confirmation that an opportunity would soon exist, a narrow one, a single chance. If he missed it, there would be no second attempt. In the next part of this story, we will uncover the extraction itself, a maneuver so risky that it forced both sides of the Cold War to gamble with consequences they could not fully control, and that would determine whether this American spy would ever leave East Germany alive. The opportunity, when it finally arrived, was almost invisible. No helicopters, no dramatic border crossings under gunfire. Real espionage rarely looked like the movies. Instead, it came disguised as routine bureaucracy, hidden inside the dull machinery of Cold War procedure. A temporary diplomatic adjustment, a logistical oversight, a moment when paperwork moved faster than suspicion. For the American spy, this was the narrow opening his handlers had hinted at, the single thread he could either grasp perfectly or lose forever. The plan depended on exploiting a weakness in East Germany's relationship with its allies. While the regime prided itself on absolute control internally, it still relied on cooperation with other Eastern Bloc nations. Transit corridors, diplomatic convoys, and shared facilities created spaces where authority overlapped and responsibility blurred. The extraction route would move through one of these gray zones where no single agency held full control. That uncertainty was the shield. Disguised under a new identity, supported by documents that would not withstand close inspection but were sufficient under pressure, the American entered the flow of authorized movement. His appearance had changed subtly, not dramatically enough to draw attention, but enough to break visual continuity. Surveillance relied heavily on recognition. Break that, and even the most disciplined system hesitated. Every step forward was calculated, every delay avoided. He did not look nervous, he looked bored. Boredom was believable. As the convoy approached the checkpoint, tension peaked. East German officers were present, but so were representatives from another Allied state. This created hesitation. No one wanted to overstep. No one wanted to be responsible for delaying an officially approved movement. The American kept his gaze forward, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow. A single question could expose him. A single glance too long could unravel everything. The inspection was brief, too brief. Papers were checked, stamps verified, and then, almost anticlimactically, the barrier lifted. The convoy moved forward. At that moment, the American crossed a line that few had crossed successfully. He was no longer fully inside East Germany's control, but safety was still far away. Only hours later did the Stasi realize what had happened. Patterns didn't match. Records conflicted. A man who should not exist had moved through a space he should never have accessed. The response was immediate and furious. Internal investigations exploded. Officers were interrogated. Procedures rewritten overnight. But it was too late. The American was already beyond reach. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to acknowledge fear, not during the operation, not at the checkpoint, but after, because survival brought a different weight, memory. Every face he had known under false names, every lie that had kept him alive, every risk that had almost killed him. Espionage did not end when missions ended. It followed agents for life. Back in the West, debriefings began immediately. What he revealed confirmed long-standing suspicions about East German military coordination, internal instability, and the true reach of the Stasi. His intelligence reshaped strategic planning at the highest levels, quietly, without headlines, without recognition. That was the price of success. Officially, the American spy never existed. No medals, no public acknowledgement. His name remained buried in classified files, but within intelligence circles, his operation became a case study in patience, psychological endurance, and the terrifying cost of long-term infiltration. Yet, the story did not end with his escape, because the consequences of his mission rippled outward, affecting people who had never known who he truly was, and some of them paid a heavy price. In the final part, we will explore the aftermath, the lives disrupted, the lessons learned, and why this infiltration remains one of the most chilling examples of Cold War espionage ever carried out. Escape did not mean freedom. For the American spy, survival came wrapped in silence. Once safely beyond the reach of East Germany, he entered a world that looked familiar, yet felt completely foreign. He had spent so many years living as someone else that returning to his own identity felt unnatural, almost dangerous. Every sound seemed louder, every street felt exposed. He was constantly aware of exits, of reflections in windows, of people standing still for too long. The habits that had kept him alive behind the Iron Curtain refused to fade. Espionage leaves no clean endings. Behind him, the consequences were severe. The Stasi launched one of its most aggressive internal purges in years. Officers were demoted, interrogated, and quietly removed. Civilians, connected even loosely to the agent's former life, were questioned relentlessly. Some lost jobs, some disappeared into administrative detention. The system needed someone to blame, and when it could not reach the real target, it turned inward. This was how authoritarian intelligence services protected the illusion of control. Failure was never admitted, it was reassigned. Western intelligence agencies studied the operation in exhaustive detail. What had worked was documented, what had nearly failed was dissected. New protocols were written, not to celebrate success, but to prevent repetition of the same risks. Long-term human infiltration became even rarer after that. Too expensive, too dangerous, too psychologically destructive. Technology would replace people wherever possible. Satellites, signals intelligence, remote surveillance. The human spy, once the centerpiece of intelligence work, was slowly becoming a liability. The American agent was offered a quiet life, a new role, a desk, safety. He declined most of it. After years of living under constant threat, normal life felt hollow. He carried knowledge that could never be shared, stories that could never be told, and faces he would never see again. Even among his own handlers, there was distance. He reminded them of what their work truly cost, not in money, but in lives fragmented beyond repair. Behind him, the official records erased him completely. No photographs, no service history, no acknowledgement. If he spoke, he would be denied. If he wrote, it would remain classified. His success depended on his anonymity. The world moved on, unaware that some of its most stable moments during the Cold War were shaped by people who were never allowed to exist. Years later, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, many wondered how such a controlled system could collapse so quickly. The truth is, it didn't collapse overnight. It was weakened, slowly, quietly, by information flowing where it was never meant to go, by men and women who lived double lives so convincingly that even history struggled to remember them. The American spy who infiltrated East Germany was one of those invisible forces, applying pressure where no one could see it. Today, fragments of operations like his surface in declassified documents, interviews filled with omissions, and stories that still feel incomplete. Names are missing, details blurred. That is intentional, because some truths are too dangerous to tell fully, even decades later. What remains is a lesson written between the lines of history. Wars are not always fought with armies. Sometimes they are fought in silence, inside ordinary lives, where survival itself becomes the mission. And somewhere, perhaps still alive, perhaps already gone, the man who once walked unnoticed through the streets of East Germany exists only as a shadow. A reminder that the most powerful weapon of the Cold War was not nuclear, mechanical, or technological. It was human, and it came at a price few would ever be willing to pay.